Welcome to this first aid course. We will discuss how to provide first aid as an advanced first aider. This course is presented by Safe Train Consulting. Section 1. Principles of Advanced Primary Emergency Care. First aid is the aid that is given to an injured or sick patient on the scene before more advanced help arrives. The first aider must make use of his own personal knowledge and logic, as well as his or her ability to improvise. People require first aid because of accidents, illness, and chemical contamination that leads to a loss of working hours and income. The total of injuries can be drastically reduced if everyone works in a safe manner and does not take chances, as well as if everyone makes sure he or she is skilled in first aid. Industrial accidents usually happen far away from medical facilities. Most injuries are minor, but even a minor injury can become infected if the workplace is dirty and therefore lead to death. The immediate covering of these injuries will decrease this possibility. The careless handling or transportation of an injured person can cause more damage to the injury and cause more pain and suffering. First aid can fall into two main categories, namely, treatment in a life-threatening situation awaiting medical help. Treatment for minor injuries. There is a variety of first aid equipment available, and there are specific procedures to follow when dealing with people who are injured in the workplace. The purpose of this chapter is to describe and explain the different equipment to support the first aider, in line with specific procedures he or she must follow to comply with policies and legislation requirements. It is important to treat injuries, whether minor or serious, immediately, and where the accident occurred, through applying first aid methods. First aid can save limbs and lives. First aid training is readily available and only takes a little of your time. This course will teach you the correct way to render first aid to an injured person. The first aid recovery with sound first aid principles. Properly applied first aid methods can save lives and reduce recovery time. If the correct first aid methods are applied, then it can mean that there may be a difference, for example, between temporary disability and lifelong disability for the victim. First aiders should learn to recognize the signs and symptoms of injuries and sudden illness. The first aider is also likely to be trained in dealing with injuries such as cuts, grazes, or broken bones. They may be able to deal with the situation in its entirety, for example a small adhesive bandage on a paper cut, or may be required to maintain the condition of something like a broken bone until the next stage of definitive care, when an ambulance arrives. First aid principles. The first aid principles are as follows. To preserve life. Protect the unconscious casualty. Prevent the condition worsening. Promote recovery. Call for medical assistance. The first aider. The first aider must be aware of the standard of care he is able to provide, as this standard of care relates directly to the concept of negligence. If the correct standard of care was not provided, the individual will be judged according to hypothetical persons of similar training and experience. The first aider should work in a systematic manner to provide basic life support. Prevent the condition from becoming worse. Promote recovery. Alert the emergency services as necessary, for example the police, fire brigade, and/or ambulance. The role of the first aider. They should recognize an emergency, take charge and delegate, gather info and provide basic life support, alert the emergency services, support the patient, hand the patient over and report. Psychological barriers. Besides the safety aspects, there are psychological and physical barriers, which one may need to address before you can go ahead and assist. The problem may stem from within oneself, the emergency, or the victim. Consent. When a first aider goes to someone's aid, he undertakes to provide any assistance he can give safely, and to remain on the scene until the casualty can be handed over to medical assistance, or some other authority. The first aider is given certain protections under the law. Therefore, he should not be overly concerned about legal liability. Consent is divided into 4 categories. 1. Actual or expressed consent. The injured gives verbal consent that the first aider can continue with treatment. 2. Implied consent. When the injured cannot give consent, and a significant risk of death exists, the first aider can continue with treatment. 3. Minor's consent. The parent or guardian of the injured child gives consent, and the first aider renders assistance. When no parent or guardian is present, and the child is under the age of 12 years, the first aider renders assistance. When the child is older than 12 years, the rule for actual and implied consent applies. 4. Consent of the mentally ill. The same as for minors' consent. Statutory requirements. The Occupational Health and Safety Act 85 of 1993 requires the employer to bring about, and maintain, as far as reasonably practicable, a workplace that is safe, and without risk to the health of the workers. This means the employer must investigate the following: that the workplace is free of hazardous substances, such as benzene, chlorine, and microorganisms, articles, equipment, processes, etc., that may cause injury, damage, or disease. Where this is not possible, the employer must inform workers of these dangers, and how to work safely, and provide personal protective equipment for a safe workplace. However, it is not the sole responsibility of the employer to adhere to the Occupational Health Safety Act, but the worker is also responsible that he or she adheres to the regulations within this legislation. In short, this means that the worker and the employer share responsibility regarding health and safety in the workplace. The Act, known as the Occupation Health and Safety Act 85 of 1993, consists of 50 sections approved by Parliament. The purpose of the Act is to provide for the health and safety of persons at work, or in connection with the use of plant and machinery. It also provides for the protection of persons, other than persons at work, from hazards arising out of or in connection with the activities at work. This means that, in terms of South African legislation, each employer must maintain a safe and healthy workplace which is free from all reasonable hazards. All factories must be kept clean and free of smells or leakages arising from drains and toilets or any other nuisance. In addition to a safe and healthy work environment, there should also be receptacles for waste. The aisles, roadways, and passages should be properly marked. The stockpiling of materials should be prohibited or carefully monitored. There should be proper storage space. Notices should be put up for staff. And color coding should be introduced in the factory. Legal aspects. The first aider must be aware of the level of treatment that he or she can provide. The level and standard of treatment relate directly to the concept of negligence. When the correct standard of care is not provided, the first aider will be judged according to a hypothetical person with similar training and experience in court. In other words, what would a reasonable man do? At no time should untrained personnel be allowed to administer first aid in an emergency, as this could seriously increase the severity of the injuries and result in unnecessary death. Get consent if conscious, and explain procedures, respecting that the patient's religion, culture, and/or if the patient is a minor. All first aid procedures must be recorded and reported accurately. Every patient has the right to confidentiality and privacy. Duty of care. Duty to care describes the legal duty owed by one person to another to act in a certain way. As a first aider, you have a duty of care towards your patients to exercise reasonable care and skill in providing first aid treatment. The duty arises because you have knowledge and skills relevant to a medical emergency situation. If you choose to provide first aid assistance, you have a duty to use your knowledge and skills in a responsible way. The common law does not impose an automatic duty on first aiders to go to the aid of every patient they come across. However, first aiders do have a duty to provide first aid assistance if they have voluntarily taken on that role. For example, a nominated first aid officer in a workplace owes a duty of care to assist another person in that workplace. Once you start first aid treatment of a patient, you do take on a duty of care to provide first aid with reasonable skill and care and ensure your actions do not increase the risk to the patient. You should continue to provide first aid once this treatment has begun until the scene becomes unsafe. Another trained first aider or higher qualified medical help arrives and takes over. The patient shows signs of full recovery. You become physically unable to continue. The law in South Africa is very lenient towards first aiders, and it excludes from liability a person where, in an emergency, they help a person who is, or risks being injured. Such protection from civil liability for an act or omission exists as long as the person rendering assistance does so in good faith. That is, acting honestly, without fraud, collusion, or participation in any wrongdoing. The person's action was without expectation of reward or payment. The person was not responsible for the injury in relation to which the assistance was provided. The person's capacity to exercise reasonable care and skill was not significantly impaired by being under the influence of alcohol or drugs. The person exercises reasonable care and skill. And the person does not impersonate a healthcare or emergency services worker, or a police officer, or otherwise falsely represents that he or she has skills or expertise in connection with the rendering of emergency assistance. In addition, South Africa has legislation which provides protection for volunteers of charitable, religious, educational, and benevolent community organizations. Such volunteers are protected from civil liability for acts or omissions made or done in good faith within the scope of the activities organized by the community organization. The protection does not extend to damage caused by the volunteer's criminal conduct or impairment of the volunteer's ability by alcohol or drugs. Negligence. In the unlikely event that legal action is taken against a first aider, in connection with providing first aid assistance, the courts would look at the circumstances surrounding the event to see if the first aider acted in a negligent manner when the first aid was provided. The following factors must all be present for a first aider to be found negligent. A duty to care existed between the first aider and the patient. The first aider did not exercise reasonable care and skill in providing the first aid. Breach the relevant standard of care. And the patient sustained damage as a result of an act or omission of the first aider. A first aider is not considered a professional in most cases. A court would look at the first aider's training and at what a reasonable person would have done with the same level of training in the same circumstances. Because encouraging people to assist others is in the public interest, it is likely that the South African courts would only see first aiders as liable if it can be shown that their behavior was grossly negligent, and would take account of all the circumstances of the event. The court may examine issues to establish whether the first aider exercised reasonable care, such as: what was the first aider's level of knowledge? What information was available for the first aider, including: was adequate questioning used? Was a thorough examination of the patient undertaken? Were all the facts available considered? Were accepted first aid procedures complied with? What were the circumstances in which the first aider helped? Example: a first aider gives CPR to a patient in cardiac arrest. During this CPR, a rib is broken. The resuscitation is successful, and after the event the patient decides to sue the first aid practitioner for the rib injury. The court would look at the facts and may decide that it is reasonable to expect that a first aider might break a patient's rib while delivering CPR to save the patient's life, and the first aider acted with reasonable care and skill, and the first aider was not negligent in providing CPR in this way, and the outcome for the patient of not performing CPR could have been far worse than suffering a broken rib. Recording. First aider should always make notes or fill out patient report documentation when care is rendered, no matter how minor the emergency might be. Proper records will help you to recall the incident if you are ever asked about it at a later stage. The responsibility is greater if you have a role as a first aider in your workplace, and you may have reporting obligations under the occupational health and safety legislation. You can check this with your workplace occupational health and safety representative. Records may be used in a court, so ensure that your reports or notes are legible, accurate, and factual, contain all relevant information, and are based on observations rather than opinions. When preparing a report, some general guidelines should be followed. Use ink only for any notes and remarks. Sign and date the record. Any corrections should be crossed out with a single line and initialed. Do not use correction fluid to correct any mistakes. The information should be kept confidential and should only be accessed by authorized people. In a workplace incident, a copy should go to authorized employer representatives for auditing and occupational health and safety monitoring purposes.